Hello, I'm Ross Bolch, and thank you for tuning into my talk, Pandemics Through History. Basically, I'm trying to look at the pandemics that we've seen through history, and spoiler alert, there are a lot, and kind of what we've learned about them, and hopefully what we can learn from them in the future. My name is Ross Bolch. Many of you may know me as one of the co-founders of Brisbane Skeptic Society and the first president of that society. We hosted the Skeptic Convention a few years back now in Brisbane, which was a lot of fun. There's just a picture of me there this is actually on the River Ganges in Varanasi, and I'm holding a good look sort of candle, and you're supposed to let it float along the river, but mine sank, so I don't know what that says about my look. I kind of thought you folks as skeptics would appreciate that little anecdote. As well as being a skeptic, though, I'm also a scientist. What I do is actually look at diagnostics into things like sepsis. So I use mostly DNA data. So at the moment, it takes about 48 hours to get a solid ID on a bacteria. I'm hoping to reduce that to about 6 using purely gene sequencing technologies. I also do a lot of science communication. I'm the host of the Science Club show, and I'm also a huge nerd. As you can see, that picture there is me with a fantasy tavern background. At the moment, you can see I have my lovely fantasy study as my green screen. And also, I am on a podcast called Dungeons and Doctorates, which is a Dungeons and Dragons podcast spoken from the point of view of a PhD student. So a few of us are PhD students, and we kind of go along life in a fancy university playing Dungeons and Dragons, which is a lot of fun. So if any of you are so inclined, you can check me out in all of these various places around the internet. But today I am here to talk to you about the history of what I've termed pathademics, which is a completely made-up term. But the reason that I say that is because really when we talk about things like pandemics, we're actually grouping a lot of different things. Mostly endemic things. These are things that kind of live within the population all the time. Epidemics, which are sort of outbreaks that really are confined to one geographical area moving outwards, but typically are larger than what would be normally an endemic. And then pandemics, of course, where something moves from one location to several locations around the globe, pan meaning the world. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, the history of pandemics is long. We have been, basically since we've had recorded history, we've had pandemics in human culture, especially human societies. And the society part is actually going to be quite important, I think, as we move on, because societies actually are what enable these kind of diseases to spread a lot more than they would have, say, when we were nomadic. The first one on here is the Antonin Plague, which we'll get into, but I'm actually going to talk a little bit about one not even on this infographic here, which is excellent, by the way. It's on visualcapitalist.com, really good. I actually recommend that you check this out if you're interested, like I am, in sort of pandemics and infectious disease in general. So let's start our little tour of pandemics by looking at an incident, really, from ancient China. This is about 5,000 years ago, and this comes from some relatively recent archaeology, which I think is cool that we're still discovering all of these things. So essentially, we have this site. It's in Hamin Manga, which I'm probably not saying correctly. Sorry for any people who speak the language. And it's actually one of the largest and best preserved prehistoric settlements that we actually know about in China. Going back about 5,000 years now. And there were about 29 to 40 different houses, and they were all pretty simple. You know, this was, very kind of old cultures, really just a doorway, a fire, and, a place to sleep, as were many ancient dwellings. But one of the interesting things that was found here is that there was a particular house that had almost 100 bodies essentially just dumped into this house. And that's very interesting because humans don't tend to just dump bodies. One of the things that humans have done throughout their entire history is really be very specific about how we bury our dead. Part of it is culture, part of it is superstition, part of it is sanitation. And we'll get to that a bit later as well. But these skeletons were literally dumped from the center of the house and essentially just in a spiral outwards. And what this means is that the people who died here died extremely quickly. The people of this town did not have time to worry about burials or any kind of rituals. The bodies were just kind of dumped in this one place. And it makes you think that they really wanted these bodies out of the way. And that's very suggestive of the fact that some kind of epidemic happened in this town that killed very quickly. We don't know what it is. I'm actually hoping that as time goes by, we'll be able to do this. What we'll talk about in some of these other pandemics is that now we have DNA sequencing tools. We can actually go back to things like the teeth of the victims of these kinds of plagues, try and see if we can get DNA, and it gives us a really good picture of what might have happened. So we don't know if this was a virus or bacteria, but there's a very good chance that this is one of the earliest sort of evidences we have of these mass epidemics that were, unfortunately in this case, obviously very lethal to the inhabitants of this town. If you imagine there were only 29 houses, this would have been a significant portion of this town. But we go to now the ones that are really classic, the ones that we talk about a lot. And the first one is this plague of Athens, which we don't know exactly what it is, but we think it might be typhoid, and that's based on the symptoms that were present at the time. Now, I've labelled this one Enemy at the Gates, and that's because essentially what happened with this particular epidemic, I guess, plague, is that there was a disease coming through from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa at the time, and the Greeks were fighting the Spartans, and unfortunately Athens was under siege by the Spartans, which really played a big part in this epidemic taking hold in the city, as has happened through history a lot of times. And essentially what happened is this disease got into Athens. It was a very rough disease, a lot of like bleeding, fevers, gastrointestinal problems, and it spread quickly. They reckon about 2/3 of the citizens of Athens died, and that's because they were in such close quarters being sieged into the city. Now, while the most popular theory actually is that this is typhoid, there's actually some interesting theories that it could be Ebola because of the way the disease made its way up through regions of Africa that typically we now know do have a host of Ebola that is endemic. It's not a very popular theory, but it is quite interesting, and it obviously is a good exercise in epidemiology, the way that we track diseases, and we have to really just make guesses a lot of the time in these ancient plagues because we don't always have the remains or the evidence anymore to know exactly what happened. The next one is the Antonin Plague, and this actually kind of forms part of what I'm going to call like a double hit. And the reason for that is that we think that maybe this is the first time that measles and smallpox both hit this part of Western Europe for the first time in these introductions. So these plagues are kind of linked in a way because they happen quite close together and they had a huge impact on Roman culture. And we do think that that is maybe the first time that these diseases reach the continent. And kind of what can happen when a disease reaches a continent for the first time, because the diseases are never seen by the humans in this area. And so essentially we have no immunity and no defenses really against these new, in this case, viruses. So the Romans at the time were fighting the Parthians, and really this disease came from them via the soldiers back into the Roman Empire. And in this particular one, the symptoms that were described are very similar to that of smallpox. The fevers, the bleeding, and then for people who survived long enough, which a lot of people didn't, those kind of characteristic pustules would start to occur. And they think that in this particular instance, the Roman Empire may have lost around 5 million citizens to this plague, and it greatly affected their military prowess at the time, remembering that at this point in time, the Roman Empire was still expanding, and that really affected the state of their military concerns. And really not too long after that, maybe only 100 years, we have the plague of Cyprian. Again, we don't know exactly what it is, but there are some definite hints that it could be something like measles or smallpox. And remember, to a completely immune-naive population, something like measles could be a lot more devastating, especially with the state of medicine at the time, than it would be for us today, even when we today recognize that measles is still a very serious disease. And one of the cool things about this is actually that the bodies that were found as part of these archaeological digs had a very thick layer of lime around the bodies. And what this shows us is that even early on, as these kind of plagues took hold, people were starting to realize that sanitary ways to dispose of bodies are very important. And lime is known to be a pretty potent disinfectant, and that was used. Now, in this particular case, they think that up to 5,000 people a day in Rome only, not just the empire, but in Rome, were dying. So this was a massive blow to the Roman Empire and really spelled the end of the Roman Empire at that time. Interestingly, culturally, a few things were happening as well. Because of the lack of military prowess, Rome was not able to keep at bay a lot of the pagans that were trying to reclaim territory from the north. And also, this event is thought to be a very large catalyst for the expansion of Christianity in Rome, as Christian preachers essentially capitalized on the plague to make converts of people who, I guess, felt abandoned by the Roman gods at the time. Now, this one, of course, you would all know, the Black Death, is probably the most famous plague of all time. And for good reason, actually. You can see this plague lasted years, which, we've been locked down as part of COVID for about 9 months now. Imagine the constant terror of this happening in your lives for 9 years. It's a long time. And what we now know is that the Black Death was caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. And we actually think that it was caused by a particularly nasty strain that has now died out, since the conditions for this to spread are really not existing the way they did back then. Half of all of Europe is thought to have died from this plague, which is a huge part of the population. And also, this plague was thought to actually originate from Asia and come through trade caravans. So again, we see the movement of people is a very big factor in pandemics taking hold. And the thing is with this plague is because so many died, half of Europe and they think a third of the entire world, this actually had a massive cultural impact. So what happened after this is that there was a huge shortage of labor. You can imagine even back then, people who were of higher socioeconomic status, had big estates, were much better protected from this kind of thing than commoners were, because people with more money and resources, they could live in larger estates further away from people, less likely to have these pests running around. We know that the transmission vector for this was infected rats. Fleas would actually take the bacteria from the fleas and transfer it onto humans. And obviously people with more common means would not have as sanitary a lifestyle and were more likely to get hit by this. But what this resulted in was a very large shortage of labor and actually improved living conditions for people of common descent after this, because they had to be treated better, because at the end of the day, there were not enough people to fend for the land and things like that. So it's important to remember that pandemics don't just affect individuals, but they affect societies massively, as of course we're seeing today with COVID. Now, this is kind of an interesting one. This is actually a kind of pandemic that popped up multiple times over this time period. And for a long time, we really didn't think we knew what it was. But recent DNA evidence has shown that what happened here is that this portion of Mexico and Central America, these populations got essentially ravaged by this bacterium, Salmonella paratyphi type C. Again, a kind of like typhoid. Typhoid has popped up a lot in human history before the advent of the kind of sanitation that we have today. Now, in the first wave, 15 million people in Mexico and Central America perished to this disease, which is an absolutely huge amount. And in subsequent versions of this, 5 million more would unfortunately succumb. And one of the things that I think is an important takeaway with this is that not only at the time were they dealing with this massive infection, but they were also dealing with really bad droughts. Like in the literature, they're described as mega droughts. And you'll find through history that a lot of factors have to kind of combine. And here I've called it a series of unfortunate events. That sometimes just the presence of a bug isn't enough, but you actually really need this confluence of events, sometimes a drought, to cause this kind of thing, because you can imagine with water shortage, they just couldn't be as judicious with water as they could have been before, and this probably meant that they had to drink water of poor quality, and it spread quickly. And unfortunately, this really did spell the end for the Aztec culture in this area at that time. Next, we go to possibly one of the largest genocides of all time, but also a lot of that was to do with plague. So it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but like I've actually said Homo sapiens are the cause for this, and that isn't untrue. Like, European invaders physically killed a large number of indigenous people, which in and of itself you could consider a plague. But the thing that we actually did was introduce smallpox and measles to a completely naive population. And this had an absolutely massive effect. Because these people were naive to the disease, there was no immunity. Everyone was susceptible. There was no kind of herd immunity at all. And because of the state of medicine at the time and the severity of these diseases, they actually estimate that up to 90% of the population of the Americas died as a result of this invasion and then the diseases that followed. And so these days, we're actually quite cognizant of this when we actually approach cultures that are still quite isolated. This is something that we really have to be careful of, because it can very easily rip through a naive population. And obviously we're seeing again today with COVID how none of us are immune to this disease. So the sheer amount of susceptibility can have a huge factor in whether pandemics are successful or not. And really, this is one of the darkest moments in human history, I would argue, that just the sheer scale of destruction that the combo of invasion and disease had on this part of the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about the various plagues again. So I talked about the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, the Bubonic Plague. Again, this plague would rip through Europe several times over this period of about 100 years. And it's kind of interesting because at this point, we've really started to learn about how these pandemics work and the kind of diseases and how we can treat them. So it's at this time that, although quarantine has been a concept for a very long time, quarantining really became prevalent at this time. This was a time of much larger global trade networks. Ships were sailing into cities on a very common basis. And the word quarantine actually comes from a Venetian word, which means 40 days. And obviously 40 days has some biblical implications, which might be one of the reasons that number was chosen. But as luck would have it, and obviously one of the things that maybe these civilizations figured out at this time was that the plague had about a 30 to 38 day incubation period. And so if they could quarantine ships for 40 days, they could often prevent an outbreak. Now, of course, the problem, and what they didn't quite know at the time, is that the main vector for this disease, unfortunately, were rats and fleas. And it would be very easy for a infected rat to escape a ship and make its way into a port town. As many plagues, one in Marseille, obviously a very famous one in London, and as it happened, the Great Fire of London probably actually hastened the end of the London Plague. These events were happening around the same time, and it's hard to know exactly whether there was a causal relationship, but certainly sort of a reduction in rats, fleas, and obviously thinning of the population probably helped a lot. And really, humans have learned a lot from these plagues over the years, especially. Now, an interesting one here is the plague, or an epidemic more, that in Philadelphia in 1793. And this time it's yellow fever. So this is the first time that we're actually starting to see a rise in vector-borne diseases making their way out of places like Africa, where they were a lot more common for there to be vector-borne diseases. And in this case, it's a mosquito. And the interesting thing is that even in 1793, there were those people who suspected that actually the mosquito were to blame, because they always noticed as the yellow fever cases increased that there were an increase in cases of yellow fever. Of course, we didn't know about viruses then. There was still a lot of like miasma theory was still very much in vogue at the time, and that actually made the leap to blaming mosquitoes. Most people did not accept this theory. The interesting thing is that they actually did quarantine the cities. Philadelphia was one of the cities, but a couple of other cities also became afflicted with a yellow fever epidemic at this time. But within the city, quarantining kind of failed because, unfortunately, in this case, in a densely packed city like Philadelphia would have been, being the capital at the time of the US, quarantine wasn't as successful because mosquitoes were not subject to quarantine. And had they known about mosquitoes back then and accepted that, maybe they could have actually used something like nets. And ironically, rather than quarantining, sending people to more isolated, cold areas could have actually helped because mosquitoes have a really specific range that they can live in. And if the temperature and the amount of water around the place is not ideal, mosquitoes can't thrive. So actually abandoning some of the classic ideas in that case could have helped. And that's why it's really important to very thoroughly understand what you're dealing with when it comes to pandemics, because there is no one-size-fits-all answer for any particular pandemic. And then, of course, we have cholera. Now, I've labeled this as 1852, but really cholera has been around for a very long time. And a little throwback to my trip along the Ganges, they think cholera may have originally actually come from the delta of the Ganges and worked its way up through India and into Europe, and then eventually spread almost globally as travel and human trade spread this disease around. Of course, cholera is caused by Vibrio cholerae, and it's very much like a fever and gastrointestinal disease. It's made worse by the fact that Vibrio is very motile, which means it can move around a lot, and it gets into everything. But it's actually a very important epidemic and pandemic in the world, because really what cholera did was birth this sort of idea of epidemiology, which is the idea that you can actually track down the movement and spread of disease based on its properties. And of course, famously, John Snow used cholera in really one of the very first cases of cluster detection to track down the source of the outbreak. And this very famous map showed that people living next to a very particular contaminated well, they were more likely to get cholera. And by actually removing the pump handle, they were able to stop the spread of cholera in this area. Cholera has also been very well studied by early microbiologists during this period, and it was also one of the diseases that led to things like modern medical microbiology and things like Koch's postulates, which we kind of still use to determine whether a particular microbe is causing a particular disease. Unfortunately, cholera is still around in a lot of less privileged areas of the world today, and is still a huge cause of death throughout the world. Now, I'm actually going to go through the flu, and instead of going chronologically like I have before, I'm going to talk about the flu in general, and then go back to a few more chronologicals, because there's a lot of flu. And really, the flu pops up, we think, in a big way for the first time in 1889. Mostly it affected Russia. 100,000 people died in Moscow. And it's very interesting to talk about this particular case because there were big quarantining efforts in Russia to try and stop the spread of this disease. In fact, the ruler Catherine at the time, she ordered all of the factories to be shut, people to stay in their homes. But not too unlike today, there were riots over the quarantining as fear and people obviously wanting to get on with their lives took over. And this actually led to Archbishop Ambrosius getting murdered because he actually, which is kind of interesting because it's the opposite of what we're seeing today in some cases. He actually was trying to say that worship and gatherings of worship should be suspended while this flu was happening, which, as I've said, compared to today, some churches seem not to have that same view. But it definitely has shown us already in history the kind of reactions that humans can have to these kinds of measures. And I think it's worth trying to learn from these to guide the kind of decisions that we make today. So the flu, again, 1918 to 1920. Of course, this one is a much more famous version of the flu. I've called this the big one. This was an absolutely, truly massive pandemic flu. It was avian in origin, which had a big part to play in why it was so deadly to humans. And also, this pandemic really is one of the first times that we see a shift in how human culture has changed the way pandemics are occurring in the world. A lot of the previous pandemics were very sanitation related. This one is really, though, to do with the amount of global travel that was happening. Of course, this comes on the backdrop of a world war, soldiers moving all over the world and then bringing back this really horrendous flu to the world. 50 million people at least died globally. That is a minimum estimate. And what's remarkable about this one is that it had a very high mortality rate in younger people and healthy people. And we can speculate a little bit about why that is. There is some evidence that in naive populations, the immune system can react much more strongly to these kinds of flus, but we don't know that for sure. But maybe that's a reason that younger and healthy people were so taken by this, but also the fact that younger, healthier people like soldiers were one of the main vectors, of course, and that probably had a big part to play as well. And also, this is one of the first times that we've really tracked this back down to a non-human origin. We can probably suspect that some of these previous pandemics may have emerged from animals, but this one we have genetic evidence now that it was avian in origin, and one of the reasons is that it was so devastating to the human population at the time. Of course, another interesting thing is we have this really good case study here because the way that people reacted to this flu, just in the United States alone, varied massively. Some cities went into really strong lockdown. St. Louis is one of those. But cities like Philadelphia, they didn't do that. And in fact, they went so far beyond not locking down that they had this huge parade that I have pictured here. And flu just wiped through the population in Philadelphia. That the flu was very, in Philadelphia, that the flu just really was not kind to that city, to the point where St. Louis, who shut down schools, universities, theaters, that kind of thing, they only had an eighth of the death rate of the per population than Philadelphia did. And we have some interesting studies as well that cities that enacted strong lockdown policies in that time actually fared better economically after the pandemic was over, as shown in this study here. And I think that's an important lesson in our time in COVID, because obviously a lot of the only arguments for ending lockdowns is mostly the economic argument when it comes to COVID. Obviously, there's the interpersonal argument and the psychological argument, which are very valid, but it seems like economically, containing the outbreak is a lot better for your economy in the long term than letting everyone die, which might seem like common sense, but not to a lot of people. I'll breeze past this one. We have, again, the flu. This one is called the Asian flu. It originated in Asia. It found its way across the globe. It still killed 1 million people, which is what we're up to with COVID. So it was a significant event, but obviously nowhere near as much as the 50 million that died from the flu. The interesting thing to talk about here, though, is that actually what we find now for the first time is that we're starting to have the ability to create vaccines fairly rapidly. And the vaccine is what curtailed this particular one. And also, this is one of the events that led to there being a seasonal flu vaccination from then on. And then, of course, we have probably the final flu for now, and the one that was called originally swine flu. But really, that we think that this flu did originate in pigs, but swine flu is a little misleading to say, because it definitely, this is one of the first flus that happened in a age of wide and disseminated information. And so at some points, people were even avoiding eating pork, which you cannot catch the flu from that. But we think it began in central Mexico. It ended up killing about 285,000 people. And again, this was one of those flus, another animal origin flu, where the young and the healthy were actually quite badly affected. But the flu itself died out in 2010, mostly because the flu season, of course, waxes and wanes, but also because we were able to get a vaccination ready rather rapidly. And that is going to be a big difference that we're going to talk about as time goes on between the flus that have sort of taken hold and this new coronavirus. Because, of course, we are still waiting for a vaccine for that. So now let's talk about HIV AIDS, because this is a very different sort of pandemic. And this is a kind of pandemic that has now become endemic. And what that means essentially is that the virus started out, we think, from chimpanzees and was transferred to humans probably by bushmeat, or maybe just with contact with bodily fluids by maybe blood or saliva. But the virus got into the human population. And it's kind of interesting because these kind of events would be rare, but happening occasionally in Africa. Eating bushmeat is not an uncommon practice, but simian IV is really not easy to transfer into humans. And the interesting thing is that as travel became more common, sexual diseases in general have increased within the human population. And what we now think is that what had to happen is that another sexually transmitted disease had to be present in humans to make the HIV able to get in and take hold. So that already, the genitals were weakened to the point where the HIV could get in. And the virus slowly made its way through Africa, throughout the world, the way that sexual diseases do. And it was eventually discovered in 1981, mostly in drug users and homosexual people, because homosexual people are at slightly more risk of passing on the disease. To the point where originally it was actually called GRID, which is gay-related immunodeficiency. Luckily, that was changed because, as we now know, obviously everyone is susceptible to this. But obviously what HIV did really was I think awaken the population to how essential safe sex practices are. And it's a very interesting model for how a sexual disease can spread. And of course, we're actually in an age where sexual diseases are at an all-time high, really, in a lot of ways in populations, due to things, ironically, like Tinder and the way that we can so much more easily travel and meet new people. This little diagram that I have here, I've included because this is a skeptic conference. HIV has attracted a surprising amount of pseudoscience over the years, from the idea that it's a hoax to the idea that it doesn't exist. There's the common one where people say, well, you can't image it, which is absolute nonsense. We can do that with a variety of different imaging techniques. But this particular one is very damaging. And this actually took hold for a little while, this idea that HIV was actually spread in the 50s via the polio vaccine, which we just know to be absolutely not true. Even though the polio vaccine was made in monkey cells, we know categorically that is not how polio spread. So let's talk about SARS. This is the first of the really big coronavirus mini pandemics, more of an epidemic. Coronaviruses are with the human population basically all the time, but a lot of them are really just common cold viruses. And we find that a lot of the coronaviruses that are causing humans issues tend to be the ones that emerge from animals into humans. And this one actually was coming from civet in meat markets and began in Asia. This one only spread to around 8,000 cases, which obviously, looking onto coronavirus now, is a very small number, and around 775 deaths. So fairly high case fatality rate, but not as high as some things that we've talked about. And it mostly affected the aged and people with comorbidities, and that tends to be a pattern that we'll see with coronaviruses in general. We actually managed to contain the spread of this, and it died out in 2010. And a lot of research was put into coronaviruses, but because the virus disappeared rather quickly, a lot of that funding was cut. And I'm going to probably talk a lot about that towards the end of this presentation. Then we go to MERS, which is, as I've kind of called it, coronavirus, the sequel. This one originated in camels. We have good evidence for that. There's a good epidemiological data that shows that. And really, we don't know what made this particular virus jump from camels to humans at this time. We really don't know how long MERS coronavirus has been in camels. But we do know that it began in the Middle East and came from there. This one, again, had fairly limited spread compared to SARS, around 2,500 cases so far. And a lot of these cases really come from nosocomial, which means They've come from a healthcare setting. Someone has gotten it from a camel. Maybe they've spread it to a very small number of people. But you have to be very close to a person and into very close proximity to get this disease. But the interesting thing with this is that it really brought into focus this idea of super spreaders. So it turns out a lot of people who get this virus are not actually particularly capable of spreading it, but certain people seem to be what we call super spreaders. They will infect many more people than the average. This has a relatively high mortality rate too of 35%, which again is probably due to the fact that this is a virus that we haven't seen in humans before and that has come from an animal, and so it hasn't evolved to the point where it will be less deadly to humans. But the super spreader idea is quite important. And then we go to probably one of the most interesting epidemics of all time, the emergence of Ebola in West Africa. I was actually studying microbiology at the time and virology, so I spent a lot of time researching this particular outbreak. And I could talk about it for a very long time, but I won't talk about it too long, but it does bring up some interesting factors when it comes to pandemics. So firstly, Ebola pops up sporadically in the sort of southeast of Africa from time to time. And it normally has a very intense but short duration as it spreads within a couple of local villages. It has a very high case fatality rate, but then it kind of burns itself out. And really, for the first time, what we see in the West Africa outbreak is this virus emerged in cities. It found its way from a village to cities in Guinea and spread through the West African population quite quickly. And again, we see these series of unfortunate events. We see that it hit nations with very low numbers of resources, with a lot of civil unrest. And this really helped it spread, because what this meant is that people had a large distrust of the medical community, a large distrust of Westerners that came in to help, people like Médecins Sans Frontières. And also there are some very specific cultural practices which really helped this to spread. Laying on of hands on the body on a funeral is very common in that part of the world. And really, Ebola is not easy to spread, but unfortunately, it is quite easy to get body fluids directly onto you by touching. And unfortunately, with all of these things combined, 28,000 cases, 11,000 deaths. That's about 40% case fatality rate, which is very high. And we still think that maybe 70% of cases may have been unreported. So we don't know how many people got infected and died or got infected and recovered just from this. And so it's a very important lesson in really treating a pandemic holistically, meaning you're looking at the disease, the epidemiology, but also the society and the culture around a pandemic, because it can have a huge effect on how it spreads. And then, of course, we come to COVID. I'm actually not going to talk too much about COVID itself. I know a lot of you are probably fed up of it. I guess I mislabeled that Zika virus because I was going to talk about Zika virus, but it's actually not that interesting in this context. But of course, coronavirus is again the culprit here. As of a couple of days ago, we had 38 million global cases and over 1 million deaths. So this is on par with some of the worst flu outbreaks. And honestly, at this point, we are really not showing any sign of the number of those deaths decreasing anytime soon. Unfortunately, the United States never got this under control. And Europe, after sort of seeming to get this virus under control, is now experiencing a much worse second wave, which is actually what we saw with the flu of 1918. The second wave was much worse. And obviously, I think, and of course, sorry, I almost missed out India, which is, that is a population, unfortunately, very primed to be susceptible to the spread of this disease, with the amount of people there and the conditions that some people can live in. So I'll talk a little bit about it. It began in Wuhan, China, we think sometime in 2019. There's a lot of evidence that even though we sort of first started seeing the cases in December, we think that the virus was at least with us since September. So these crossover events maybe happened several times. We don't know. This is the third coronavirus pandemic in 20 years, which should really give us a lot of pause for thought, I think. The R0 of this is 2 to 3, which is much higher than any of the other two coronaviruses. And again, we seem to have these super spreader events where a lot of cases are coming from a single cluster, a single patient, but then a lot of those people aren't passing it on to too many people themselves, which is somewhat encouraging, but also obviously what it means is that we're sort of going to be chasing these clusters for a long time, because it will only take one or two super spread events to really kick off another wave. And of course, we still really don't know a lot about this virus. We know it's a coronavirus, and we know it has some unusual properties too, which is probably why it's spread so quickly through humans, because we are completely naive to this virus. And once again, this is an animal origin virus. We know that this came from some kind of animal host first. We're still tracking down which one, but that really is becoming a hallmark of pandemics in this modern human era. So I will talk a little bit more, though, about the fact that this is the ultimate social media pandemic. During SARS, MERS, swine flu, we had social media, but social media is at its absolute peak right now of its pervasiveness in human life. And I really think social media itself has altered the course of how we think about this pandemic. Mainly in the way that it's really propagated a lot of conspiracy theories, and also mistrust of science, and really just general hubris. So I'm going to actually preempt a few. I don't want to go through too many, because I'm aware that we actually are going to have some questions. And I'm sure a lot of you aren't going to have too many questions about the past pandemics, but you might about coronavirus. But I'll go through a few here. The idea that this virus was released on purpose. Honestly, I find this particular idea pretty racist, if I'm being honest. The fact is that the Chinese government has put in a lot of money to science infrastructure in China, and the idea that this was either released by malice or by incompetence, to me, just does not really add up at all. The labs in China are very well funded. The scientists there are very well trained. If you would not jump to the conclusion that this virus was released by accident in an Australian lab, honestly, it's very racist to assume the Chinese would have done the same. Their standards are just as high as ours. And also, I really question why you would release this on purpose. It really devastated the Chinese economy for a while, and is really not a very productive way of causing global change if you are just as susceptible yourself. There was another conspiracy that the virus was engineered, and this one we can definitively put to bed. And the reason is that unusual structure that I talked about. So it's not, the problem is that movies make it seem like it's really easy to engineer bioweapons, and it's actually not. It's incredibly difficult, and it's the reason that you just don't really see it happening in the world. Bacteria and viruses are very complex in their behavior, and engineering specific traits into them is really difficult. And the fact is that this virus has such a weird arrangement in its protein that it uses to grab onto our cells that no one would have engineered it that way, because they just wouldn't know to. You would always use something that you knew would work. You wouldn't use something novel that you haven't seen in nature before. Obviously, the idea that it's a hoax pops up a lot. I can tell you it's not a hoax. Obviously, that's my authoritarian view, but I have done the tests myself. I know this exists because I have the evidence myself. Several thousand scientists around the world have the evidence that this exists. I really don't know what else to say to you. If you want to believe that it's a hoax, you have some real deeper issues, I think, with your worldview. And obviously, look, it's not 5G. We all know that radio waves can't carry a virus. 5G is extremely safe. It falls into a frequency that just is not going to impact you at all as a human. And it's a ridiculous and silly idea, but we can go into it more if people want. And also, people are just not trusting scientists right now. There's been a very high anti-science sentiment really since the rise of the internet and social media and sort of these echo chambers. And I think a lot of people through history just want safe, easier answers, and science, unfortunately, never provides those. They're almost always messy, and I think that's why people turn to distrusting science in this time. But let's kind of summarize the things we've learned then about pandemics, because I think that is the important thing that we need to take from this history and from COVID today. Obviously, viruses can creep up on us. Sometimes they emerge from animals. they can be endemic to some very specific areas and then find their way into epidemics and then pandemics. And I think really that's the important thing when we talk about the emergence of viruses. What that means is that our surveillance efforts are not good enough, especially in a world that's getting smaller and smaller in a lot of ways. We're getting closer to animals all the time because of the way we're destroying their habitats. Humans are getting closer together. We really need there to be esoteric blue sky surveillance just to see what is going around in the population so that we can get a head start on the research. I think the single most important thing we've learned from pandemics, though, is about sanitation and hygiene. Humans learned very early on how to dispose of the dead. We burnt them, we covered them in lime. We knew that humans were, dead bodies were a dangerous source of continuing the spread, even if we didn't know how that was happening. And more than ever, sanitation of water is a huge deal in the world, and so many people still don't have access to clean water. And we would save millions of lives a year if we literally could just provide that to people around the world. And of course, hygiene. What we've seen already from COVID that just by washing your hands, washing surfaces, keeping a distance if possible, we've seen not only helping reduce the spread of COVID, but we've actually completely reduced the spread of things like the flu and other cold viruses this year. And there's no reason that once COVID goes away, we shouldn't continue, basic distancing practices, not necessarily the kind of isolationist ones that we're pursuing now, but definitely keep up the hand washing, keep up the surface. We have to be very vigilant about the fact that we are in a shrinking world and we need to be very vigilant about these things. The other thing is that societal factors of emergence are extremely important. I talked about the societal factors in Ebola. I talked about the siege in Athens. We are a very global world now, and you can actually see, as time has gone on, the kind of pandemics that have emerged have gone from these very sort of sanitary local versions to really diseases that are a way of the fact that we fly a lot. We find ourselves in a lot of enclosed spaces. Humans do not work outside for the most part now. We work indoors. And that really has changed the kind of pandemics that we are seeing. And we really have to be cognizant of the fact that we are getting closer to animals as we encroach on their territory. More of these crossover events are going to happen. And as I said, surveillance will be important. Being mindful of this, trying to find ways to actually live better with nature is going to really reduce the number of pandemics. And just be wary of the fact that some of these viruses can travel quickly. Really the response to COVID was too slow. We saw this happening in China, and instead of reacting, we waited for it to spread before we then locked down. We really could have been a lot more proactive, even if that meant affecting our economy in the short term. We would have been a lot better off in the long term had we not waited. Essentially it seemed like each country was waiting for its own evidence of this virus before they did something. And that was really way too slow. The other thing that I'm going to lead off on is research. We started to research SARS coronavirus after SARS. We spun up all these labs, and then it went away, and the sexiness of coronavirus research dropped within governments and the funding went away. We cannot keep doing this pattern. We need so much more money in research in all areas, but especially in infectious disease research. If something like this pops up, even if only in a small way, we need to continue that research. We need to develop the treatments. We need to develop the vaccine. If research had actually continued in a productive way, there's a very good chance that we would have had a coronavirus vaccine that may not have been perfect, but enough to give us a decent head start in protection. We cannot let herd immunity take over. A very large number of people are going to die, have very serious long-term effects, and it will wreck the entire world. We really need to get into a habit of really funding research well, and funding it not because it can make money and products like a lot of governments are focused on right now, but because we just need to know these things, and we need to put a lot more research into surveillance and treatments before they even become a pandemic. So that is the thing that I would say the most. Follow scientists' advice. Scientists are doing, honestly, a really good job during COVID. They're working faster than ever before. They're using technology in ways that we've never seen. Just follow their advice. I promise you that none of the health ministers of your government want you to suffer. If they're telling you need to be locked down, it's because that's what the epidemiology says. There's a study that showed that if we did a 5-month lockdown and then just opened, everything would come back and we'd have a second wave. That's what we're seeing in Europe. America had never even introduced anything. We need to take this seriously and probably like not have the hubris to think that we know better than people who are experts in this field. Thanks for watching, and I will take some questions shortly.